I'm Emily, and sharing this story makes me feel completely exposed. I haven't told anyone close to me about this deeply personal experience, but writing it down feels like it might help me sort through everything that happened last summer. My brother, Jason, and his wife, Vanessa, went away for the weekend and asked me to watch their son, Ethan. Ethan had just turned 18, a smart, thoughtful kid who was always a pleasure to be around. I figured it'd be a chill few days of hanging out, watching movies, snacking, and having some lighthearted conversations. So, I agreed without a second thought. The first day went exactly as I expected. We caught up on life, laughed at dumb jokes, and binge-watched our favorite comedy series. Everything felt normal, and I had no clue that the next day would take such a wild turn. On the second morning, Ethan told me he was heading out to meet some friends. I was glad for the quiet and decided to relax in my bedroom, happy to have the house to myself for a bit. I leaned back on the bed, scrolling through social media with the door slightly open, just enjoying the peace. After a while, I thought I'd watch something to lighten my mood. The days seemed to be rolling along like any other, nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of anything weird. But then, out of nowhere, the door swung open. I jumped, spinning around to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face a mix of surprise and confusion. "I forgot my keys, Emily," he said quickly, but there was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made me think there was more to it. For a second, time just stopped. My heart raced, and panic shot through me. I instinctively tried to cover myself, my face burning with embarrassment. My voice shook as I managed to say, "Ethan, you should knock." It came out as a strained whisper. He stepped back, mumbling an apology so quietly I barely heard it. His eyes darted around, avoiding mine, and he seemed flustered, like he didn't know how to handle the situation. Without another word, he turned and left the room. The rest of the day passed in this heavy, awkward silence. There was this weird tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Ethan, who's usually so open and easygoing, suddenly seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and acting like he didn't know what to say or do. It was like this unspoken thing hung between us, making everything feel off. That evening, we were sitting together in the living room. The warm glow of the lights made everything feel calm and peaceful, but the tension was still there, this weight I couldn't shake. Finally, I decided to bring it up. "Ethan," I started, choosing my words carefully, "let's just forget about it, okay? Let's not dwell on it anymore." I watched him closely as I spoke, noticing the slight shift in his expression. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, but his face was hard to read. His eyes, though, seemed distant, closed off. At that moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But the discomfort between us didn't go away, it just lingered, like a shadow, over the next few days. Ethan started finding little ways to spend more time with me. It wasn't obvious, nothing you could point to as intentional, but the small gestures were there. The quiet moments, the long looks he'd give me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way he'd suddenly appear in the room when I least expected it. It was like, after what happened, this unspoken connection was forming between us. Even though everything still felt wrong, I couldn't ignore the subtle bond that was quietly growing. One evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, Ethan came up to me. His steps were careful, almost hesitant, but when he spoke, his voice was firm yet tentative. "Can we talk?" he asked, the weight of his words catching me off guard. I dried my hands on a dish towel, trying to stay calm, and turned to face him. "What's on your mind?" I asked, my voice steady even though I felt uneasy. "Of course," I added, nodding, though I had no idea where this was going. "It's just, what happened, it's still on my mind," Ethan continued, his words careful, his face flushed with embarrassment. He stood there, shifting slightly, clearly unsure how to proceed. I responded quickly, maybe too quickly. "It was an accident, Ethan. You really don't have to think about it anymore." I tried to brush it off, to make the moment pass, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. But Ethan wasn't done. He stepped a little closer, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me speechless. It's not just that, he said, his voice soft but steady. Being with you, it changes how I feel. I feel like I can talk to you about anything. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stood there, stunned, not sure how to respond, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He went on, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I might feel something more than just family. You're someone I trust completely. The room seemed to freeze as his words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I was completely thrown. He was my nephew, my flesh and blood, and the idea of anything beyond a family bond between us felt not just wrong, but impossible. But as he stood there, vulnerable and sincere, something inside me shifted. I couldn't help but feel this pull toward him, a connection I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. This can't happen, Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling. Your family. My family. He looked at me, his face full of raw emotion, and said, I've never felt this way before, his voice breaking. The pain in his words was impossible to miss. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was racing, and the weight of the moment felt like it was crushing me. Desperately, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, hoping to steady us both. We need to set boundaries, I said, my voice firm even though my insides were a mess of conflicting emotions. We can't control how you're feeling, but we have to draw a line here. The air between us was heavy, thick with things left unsaid. Even after that conversation, the tension didn't go away. Ethan's presence, the way he lingered nearby, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it all reminded me of the complicated feelings I was trying so hard to ignore. No matter how much I tried to focus on my own life, I couldn't shake the pull of those emotions. Then, one night, as I sat alone, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Can I come over? I need to talk. I stared at the screen, the weight of his request sinking in. My heart raced, but after a long pause, I typed back, okay. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew things couldn't stay the same between us. When Ethan arrived, his face was serious, his steps deliberate. I know you said this isn't right, he began, his voice low, but I can't stop thinking about you, Emily. No one else makes me feel understood the way you do. I stood firm, my gaze steady as I replied, this isn't about what we want, Ethan. It's about doing the right thing. My words hung in the air, heavy with the conviction I felt. Frustration crept into his voice as he asked, why does it feel so real? His question broke the silence between us, like he was searching for an answer that could ease the tension we were both carrying. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Honestly, I didn't have a clear explanation, no easy way to make sense of the intense emotions that had taken root between us. But deep down, I knew that no matter how strong or overwhelming these feelings were, we couldn't let them lead us down a path we might never come back from. In the days that followed, we managed to keep up a semblance of normalcy, but it wasn't the same. Every glance, every moment we spent together felt charged, like the air before a storm. The tension was palpable, hanging between us like an unspoken truth. I wasn't ready to face the emotions bubbling to the surface, but Ethan's honesty and vulnerability made it impossible to ignore them any longer. For years, my marriage to Daniel had been overshadowed by the emotional distance between us. He was always absorbed in his work, often distant, leaving me to navigate the loneliness on my own. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how that emotional gap had slowly hollowed out our connection. Ethan, in his own way, had filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. That realization scared and confused me. But admitting that my marriage had become little more than a shell of what it once was felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. One evening, after Daniel had left for yet another business trip, Ethan texted me again, I need to see you. His words were urgent, raw with emotion. I paused before replying, my fingers hovering over the keys. Not tonight, I finally typed. It's too difficult. His response came almost immediately, I'll keep my distance. Please, I just need to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed, torn between my obligations and the magnetic pull I felt toward him. My heart pounded as I made the decision, knowing I was about to open a door I wasn't sure I could close. When Ethan arrived, he stood at the door, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "But I can't act like I don't care." With a heavy sigh, I stepped aside and let him in. "We've been through this before, Ethan," I said, my voice tinged with both frustration and sadness. "I know," he replied, his tone steady but filled with an underlying sorrow. "But I can see it, Emily. You're not happy. And you deserve to be." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. He wasn't wrong. Ethan had become a presence in my life that filled the emptiness I hadn't even realized was there. But acknowledging it, letting myself see how far my marriage had deteriorated, felt like a betrayal. It felt like stepping into a world from which there would be no return. "This isn't about what I deserve," I said, my voice firm but tinged with the uncertainty I was trying to hide. "It's about doing the right thing." His gaze softened, a mixture of understanding and grief reflected in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "All I ever wanted was for you to understand how I feel." That evening, after he left, I made a choice. I decided to focus on salvaging my marriage. Daniel and I arranged a weekend getaway, hoping to reconnect and rebuild what had been lost over time. But as we spent the weekend together, it became clear that the distance between us was far greater than I had hoped. Despite my efforts to engage, I found myself thinking more about Ethan than I cared to admit. Every conversation with Daniel felt strained, like we were two people who had drifted too far apart to find our way back. By the time we returned home, I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between my feelings for Ethan and my commitment to my marriage. I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation any longer. Over time, Ethan and I found a way to stay in touch, to keep some semblance of a connection without letting it go too far. We were still close, but there was a silent understanding between us, an unspoken agreement about when to stop, when to pull back. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Both of us knew the stakes, and for now, we were doing what we could to navigate the tension between our emotions and the realities of our lives.